The frozen ground crunched under Sergeant Alexei Volkov's boots as he surveyed the empty crossroads. It was March 1943, and the Eastern Front had become a graveyard of steel and dreams. Behind him, his two crew members dragged the 45mm anti-tank gun into position, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter morning air. The gun was small, almost pitiful compared to the German Panzers they would face. Soviet soldiers called it the farewell gun, because crews rarely survived after firing it. Alexei was 32 years old, which made him ancient by war standards. Most men his age were already dead or missing limbs. His face carried deep lines that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what he had seen. 3 years of war had taught him that survival was not about luck. It was about thinking differently than the enemy expected. The village behind them was called Krasny Posad, a name that meant nothing to anyone except the 200 civilians who once lived there. Now it was empty, just another dot on a map that generals would argue about in warm offices far away. The crossroads was important, though. 2 roads met here, and beyond them lay the Soviet supply depot that fed 3 divisions. If the Germans took this junction, thousands of Soviet soldiers would be cut off from food, ammunition, and hope. Private Dmitry Sokolov, the loader, was only 19. He had joined the army 6 months ago, still believing that war had glory in it. He struggled with the ammunition crates, his thin arms shaking. Corporal Ivan Petrov, the spotter, was older and wiser. He had survived the encirclement at Kiev and never spoke about it. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon, always watching, always expecting death to arrive from any direction. They had orders to delay the German advance for as long as possible. Translation: they were meant to die here while others escaped. Alexei had received such orders before. He was still alive because he refused to accept them the way they were given. The recommended gun position was behind a stone wall near the church. Good cover, good concealment, everything a textbook would suggest. Alexei stared at it and shook his head. The Germans had textbooks too. They would expect a gun there. They would shell that position first, ask questions later. His eyes moved to the collapsed barn on the left side of the crossroads. It had been hit by artillery weeks ago, and half the structure had fallen inward. The angle was wrong, completely wrong. The gun would be exposed to enemy fire from at least 2 directions. His crew would be visible. Every instinct of survival said to avoid that position. But Alexei saw something else. The geometry of the kill zone was perfect. The narrow road funneled between buildings, creating a natural choke point. From that collapsed barn, he could see 800 meters down both approaches. The rubble would hide the gun's muzzle flash. The strange angle would make it nearly impossible for the Germans to calculate where shots were coming from. "Sergeant, you cannot be serious," Ivan said when Alexei pointed to the barn. "That is a death trap." "Every position is a death trap," Alexei replied. "The question is whether we die quickly or make them pay first." Dmitry looked terrified. His hands trembled as he helped push the gun toward the barn. The 45mm gun weighed over 500 kilograms, and moving it through the rubble was exhausting work. They positioned it in the collapsed section, where broken beams created a natural frame around the barrel. From the outside, it looked like random debris. From the inside, they had a perfect field of fire. Alexei had fought at Moscow, at Rzhev, at a dozen places whose names he tried to forget. He had learned that the Germans were not supermen, despite what their propaganda claimed. They were methodical, efficient, and predictable. They followed doctrine. When they saw an obstacle, they dealt with it in specific ways. Understanding those ways meant you could make them hesitate, make them doubt, make them waste time. Time was everything in war. Not territory, not glory, not even victory, just time. Every minute the Germans spent here was a minute they were not somewhere else. Every hour of delay was an hour for reinforcements to arrive, for defenses to be built, for someone else to live. The morning stretched on. They waited in silence. Dmitry tried to eat but could not swallow. Ivan cleaned his binoculars 3 times, a nervous habit. Alexei checked the gun mechanism, loaded a shell, unloaded it again. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 1,000 repetitions. Around 10 in the morning, Ivan stiffened. "Engines," he whispered. "Southeast." "Multiple vehicles," Alexei listened. At first there was nothing but wind through the ruined buildings. Then he heard it too, a low rumble like distant thunder that did not stop. The sound grew steadily louder. It was not the high-pitched whine of Soviet engines. These were deeper, more powerful. German engines. He crawled to a gap in the rubble and looked through his binoculars. Dust rose in the distance, moving slowly along the road. The reconnaissance vehicles would come first, testing for resistance. Then the tanks. Always the tanks. Load armor-piercing, Alexei ordered quietly. And remember, nobody fires until I do. Not even if they are right in front of us. Dmitri's hands shook as he loaded the shell. The breech closed with a metallic click that sounded impossibly loud. They waited. The engine sounds grew clearer. Alexei could now distinguish individual vehicles. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands were steady on the gun. This was the moment between peace and chaos. The moment when everything still seemed possible. In a few minutes, men would die. Maybe including him. But for now, there was only waiting, and the sound of engines getting closer. The Battle of Kursk would not begin for another 4 months, but the Eastern Front was already drowning in blood. Germany had lost at Stalingrad, their first major defeat. Now they were desperate to regain momentum. Every village, every crossroads, every meaningless piece of frozen ground became a battlefield. And in this particular place, at this particular moment, 3 Soviet soldiers prepared to fight an entire Panzer division. The first German vehicle appeared around the bend. The German armored car rolled cautiously into view, its machine gun sweeping left and right. Behind it came a motorcycle with a sidecar, 2 soldiers scanning the buildings with rifles ready. Alexei pressed himself lower against the cold concrete, watching through a crack in the rubble. His finger rested beside the trigger, not on it. Not yet. The armored car stopped 50 meters from the crossroads. The commander stood up through the top hatch, binoculars raised. He was looking directly at the church, at the stone wall, at all the obvious positions where a defender might hide. His gaze passed over the collapsed barn without pausing. Just another piece of wreckage in a landscape full of destruction. After 2 long minutes, the commander dropped back inside. The armored car rolled forward, clearing the intersection. The motorcycle followed. They were scouting, testing, searching for resistance. Finding none, Alexei let them go. His target was not scouts. His target was what would follow them. Dmitri was breathing too fast beside him, on the edge of panic. Alexei reached over and squeezed his shoulder once, a silent message. "Stay calm, stay ready." The young private nodded, swallowing hard. 15 minutes passed. Then Ivan whispered the words they had been dreading. Panzers. Main column approaching. Through the binoculars, Alexei counted them. 12 tanks in staggered formation, rolling steadily toward the crossroads. Panzer IV medium tanks, the backbone of German armored divisions. Each one carried a 75mm gun that could destroy buildings, and armor that could shrug off most Soviet weapons. The 45mm gun Alexei commanded could penetrate that armor only at close range, only from the sides or rear, only if the shot was perfect. The tanks came closer. 400 meters. 300. Alexei could see the commanders standing in their turrets, confident, almost bored. This was supposed to be an easy advance through abandoned territory. Soviet forces had retreated from this sector 3 days ago. There was nothing here to stop them. 200 meters. The lead Panzer reached the crossroads. Alexei could hear its engine now, a deep mechanical growl. He could see the painted numbers on the turret. Number 231. That tank had fought across Russia, survived countless battles, crushed Soviet positions from Moscow to the Volga. Today it would die in a forgotten village whose name appeared on no important maps. Alexei aimed carefully. The weak point on a Panzer IV was the lower side armor, just below the turret ring. If he could hit there, the shell might penetrate into the crew compartment or the ammunition storage. Might. There were no guarantees in war, only probabilities and prayers. On my mark, he whispered. Dmitri, be ready to reload faster than you have ever moved in your life. Ivan, mark secondary targets. The lead Panzer was now in perfect position sideways to their gun. The commander was still standing in the turret speaking into a radio. He looked relaxed. He had no idea death was aimed at him from 40 meters away. Alexei breathed out slowly. Between heartbeats in that moment of absolute stillness, he pulled the trigger. The 45mm gun roared. Fire and smoke erupted from the barrel. The shell crossed the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck the Panzer exactly where Alexei had aimed, just below the turret. For one long moment, nothing happened. Then the tank shuddered. Smoke poured from the hatches. The commander tried to climb out but collapsed halfway, his uniform on fire. The other German tanks immediately halted, engines revving, turrets spinning. They were searching for the attacker but seeing nothing. The smoke from Alexei's gun had dissipated instantly in the wind. The rubble of the collapsed barn hid the gun's position. The strange angle meant the sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Reload," Alexei shouted. Dmitri had the breech open before the word was finished. The empty shell casing clanged on the floor. A new armor-piercing round slammed home. Breech closed. 3 seconds total. The German tanks were moving now, trying to spread out, but the narrow street limited their options. The burning Panzer IV blocked the lead position. Another tank tried to push past it, exposing its side. Alexei fired again. This shot hit the track, tearing it apart. The tank spun sideways, now completely blocking the road. Chaos erupted in the German column. Infantry jumped from the half-tracks, running for cover. Tank commanders were screaming into radios, demanding to know where the enemy was. 2 Panzers fired their main guns at the church at the stone wall, at every obvious position. Shells exploded against buildings, sending up clouds of dust and debris, but none of them hit the collapsed barn. Alexei had created confusion, the most valuable weapon in war. The Germans knew they were under attack, but not from where. They could not see the gun. They could not hear its exact position. All they knew was that 2 of their tanks were disabled. The road was blocked, and somewhere in this ruined village, an enemy was waiting. A German officer organized the infantry. They began moving building to building, searching systematically. Alexei watched them through his sights. They were well-trained, moving in proper formation, covering each other. But they were searching in the wrong area, focusing on the eastern buildings while his gun sat to the west, hidden in plain sight. 30 minutes had passed since the first shot. The German advance had completely stopped. Radios crackled with angry voices. The Panzers fired repeatedly at suspected positions, wasting ammunition on shadows. Alexei waited, counting his remaining shells. 18 left. Each one had to count. A Panzer III, lighter and faster than the Mark IVs, tried to find an alternate route through the buildings. It ground forward, crushing a fence, pushing through someone's yard. The angle was difficult, but Alexei adjusted his aim. The shot hit the rear deck where the engine was located. The tank coughed black smoke and stopped moving. 3 tanks disabled in 45 minutes. Not destroyed, but out of action, blocking the advance. The German commander was surely calling for artillery support now, for airstrikes, for reinforcements. But all of that took time. Time for Soviet forces to dig in elsewhere. Time for the supply depot to be evacuated. Time measured in minutes and lives. Ivan suddenly grabbed Alexei's arm. "Mortar team. 200 meters. They are setting up." Alexei swung the gun toward the mortar position. Infantry tried to wave him off, but it was too late. The 45mm shell hit the ground next to the mortar, and the explosion scattered the crew. Now the Germans knew roughly where he was. Roughly, but not exactly. Bullets began hitting the rubble around them. German machine guns opened up, firing at the collapsed barn. Concrete chips flew. A beam above them cracked from the impact. Dmitri pressed himself flat against the floor, hands over his head. But the rubble that made their position so exposed also protected them. The Germans could see the barn, but not the gun inside it. 1 hour had passed. The mighty German Panzer advance, which should have rolled through this position in 5 minutes, sat paralyzed at a country crossroads. Officers argued over tactics. Tank commanders cursed their luck. Infantry squads searched desperately for a gun position they could not find. And in a collapsed barn, firing from a suicidal angle that should have gotten them killed immediately, 3 Soviet soldiers reloaded and prepared for the next shot. The war was far from over, but for this moment in this place they were winning. Not through superior weapons or numbers, but through something the Germans had not expected. They were winning through confusion, through impossible geometry, through the simple fact that Alexei Volkov refused to fight the way anyone expected. 90 minutes into the battle, Alexei's world had shrunk to a triangle of sightlines, reload speed, and ammunition count. 15 shells remained. The collapsed barn smelled of cordite and sweat. Outside, the Germans had stopped their random shooting and were conducting a systematic search, moving from building to building with grim efficiency. The psychological game was working perfectly. Every few minutes, Alexei fired from a different opening in the rubble. A shot from the left side, then one from the right. One through the collapsed roof section, another through a gap at ground level. It created the illusion of multiple gun positions, maybe even multiple guns. The Germans were fighting ghosts. Corporal Petrov moved constantly, spotting from different angles, feeding Alexei information. Half-track moving behind the pharmacy. Infantry squad taking position in the baker's shop. Tank commander at 2 o'clock trying to coordinate. His voice was calm, professional, but Alexei could see the tension in his shoulders. They all knew this could not last forever. Dmitri had overcome his initial panic and now moved with fierce determination. Load close breech ready. Load close breech ready. His hands were bleeding from handling the rough metal shells in freezing temperatures, but he never slowed. War had turned a terrified boy into a functioning soldier in the span of 2 hours. The German infantry was close now, within 50 meters. Alexei could hear their boots crunching on broken glass, their voices calling to each other in careful coordination. He shifted the gun slightly and waited. A squad of 6 men moved past a burned-out truck heading directly toward the barn. They were cautious, weapons ready, but they still expected the gun to be somewhere else. Alexei let them get within 30 meters. Then he fired the gun at a German half-track behind them. The shot destroyed the vehicle's engine, and the explosion sent the infantry squad diving for cover. While they were disoriented, Alexei grabbed his rifle and fired 3 quick shots toward their position, not trying to hit them, just adding to the confusion. Where was the attack coming from? The gun, rifles? How many enemies were there? This was the deadly game Alexei played, not just shooting tanks but manipulating the enemy's understanding of the battlefield. Every shot raised questions. Every explosion created doubt. The Germans were no longer fighting a gun position. They were fighting uncertainty itself. A German officer stood up behind a wall trying to organize his men. Through the binoculars, Alexei could see him pointing, shouting orders. He was maybe 50 years old, a veteran, probably from the First World War. He had fought in France, in Poland, in the depths of Russia. Now he was trying to locate one stubborn Soviet gun crew that refused to die properly. The officer pointed directly at the collapsed barn. He had figured it out. Alexei saw German soldiers turning toward their position, weapons raising. There was no more time for games. Down, Alexei shouted. He grabbed Dmitri and pulled him flat, just as bullets tore through the air where they had been standing. The Germans were firing everything they had at the barn now. Machine gun bullets, rifles, even a tank gun that blasted a hole through what remained of the barn's far wall. For 3 minutes, they could do nothing but press themselves against the concrete foundation, while the world exploded above them. Pieces of wood and metal rained down. The gun itself shook from nearby impacts. Ivan cried out once sharply, then went silent. Alexei crawled to him and saw blood spreading across his shoulder. Shrapnel had torn through his jacket. "I am fine," Ivan gasped, his face white with pain. "I can still spot." The firing eventually slowed. The Germans were conserving ammunition, preparing for an assault. Alexei knew what came next. They would rush the position with infantry while suppressing it with covering fire. Standard tactics executed properly, almost impossible to stop. But Alexei was not trying to stop them. He was trying to delay them. He pulled Ivan to a more protected spot, tore open a first aid kit and pressed bandages against the wound. "Keep pressure on it," he ordered. Ivan nodded, teeth clenched against the pain. 2 hours had passed since the first shot. The German advance that should have taken 5 minutes had been stalled for 120 minutes. Somewhere behind them, Soviet forces were using that time, digging trenches, positioning artillery, preparing defenses. Every minute here was worth an hour somewhere else. Alexei moved to a new firing position and looked through the sights. A Panzer IV was trying to maneuver around the disabled tanks, pushing through a narrow gap between buildings. The angle was extreme, almost impossible. Alexei adjusted for the distance, the wind, the target's movement. He fired. The shell ricocheted off the tank's frontal armor, doing no damage, but the tank commander panicked and backed up, blocking the gap again. 13 shells left. Dmitri was at his side immediately with the next round. The young private's face was black with smoke and powder residue. His eyes were wide, almost wild, but his hands were steady. "Sergeant, they are preparing to rush us." "I can see them gathering." Alexei had been in this situation before. At Rev, his position had been overrun. He had survived by pretending to be dead among the bodies of his crew. At Moscow, he had withdrawn seconds before German flamethrowers turned his bunker into an oven. He knew when to hold and when to run, but his brother Mikhail had never learned that lesson. Mikhail had been 23, a tank commander, handsome and brave and stupid. When his T-34 was surrounded at Vyazma, he refused to abandon it even when the ammunition was gone. He had stayed and he had died. Alexei found out 3 months later through a letter that took forever to reach him through the chaos of war. Since then, Alexei had made a promise. He would never give up a position because of fear. Only because the tactical situation demanded it. Only when staying meant dying for nothing instead of dying for something. Right now, staying still meant something. It meant time. A German squad broke cover and ran toward the barn, firing from the hip. Alexei shot one of the disabled tanks, and the explosion forced them to dive for cover again. But they were learning. They were adapting. The next rush would be coordinated, overwhelming. Alexei thought about Stalingrad, where the war had turned. The Germans had been so close to victory there, just blocks away from the Volga River. But Soviet soldiers had held every building, every floor, every room. Not because they were stronger, but because they refused to break. One sniper, one machine gun crew, one desperate stand after another had bled the German army white. That was what this war had become. Not grand maneuvers or brilliant strategies, but thousands of small fights in forgotten places. Crossroads nobody had heard of. Villages with no strategic value. Each one bought with blood and stubbornness. Even called out weakly from his corner. "Sergeant, I can still fight. Save your strength," Alexei replied. But he knew they were running out of time. The Germans would not fall for the same tricks much longer. They had officers who understood warfare, soldiers who learned from mistakes. The next assault would probably succeed, probably, but not certainly. And in war, that small difference between probably and certainly was everything. Alexei loaded another shell himself, giving Dmitri's bleeding hands a moment of rest. He picked a new firing position, the fourth one they had used. The gun was getting hot from continuous firing. Outside, he could hear German voices coordinating the final assault. 2 hours and 15 minutes had passed. A German Panzer division stopped cold by 3 men and 1 small gun. It would not last much longer, but it had already lasted longer than anyone had the right to expect. The German assault came from 3 directions simultaneously. Infantry squads rushed forward under covering fire from machine guns and tank cannons. Bullets punched through the remaining walls of the barn like angry hornets. Alexei pressed himself behind the concrete foundation, waiting for the moment to act. He had learned patience in this war. Not the peaceful patience of monks or philosophers, but the violent patience of predators, waiting for exactly the right second to strike. Too early meant wasting the shot. Too late meant death. The line between them was measured in heartbeats. A Panzer III medium tank broke from cover, trying to rush past the roadblock while the infantry kept Alexei's crew suppressed. This was the real threat. If that tank got through, the others would follow, and the crossroads would be lost. Alexei swung the gun toward the moving target. The Panzer was at a sharp angle, accelerating. Commander buttoned up inside for protection. Alexei led the target, calculating speed and distance in an instant. He fired. The shell hit the Panzer III on the front glacis plate, the thickest armor. For a terrible moment, Alexei thought it had bounced off. Then the tank shuddered and stopped moving. The shot had not penetrated, but it had damaged something critical in the transmission or engine. Black smoke poured from the engine deck. The crew bailed out, running for cover while their tank died in the middle of the street. 11 shells remained. Dmitri moved to reload, but German machine gun fire tore across their position. The young private threw himself flat, shell still in his hands. Rounds sparked off the gun barrel, off the concrete, off everything. It was miracle fire, the kind that misses by centimeters but feels like it passes through your soul. When the firing paused, Dmitri completed the reload. His hands were shaking now, and blood from his torn palms smeared the shell. "Sergeant, I do not think I can do this much longer." "You can," Alexei said simply. "Because you must." That was the truth of war. People discovered they could endure impossible things simply because the alternative was dying. The human body and mind could be pushed far beyond any reasonable limit when death was the only other option. Vaughn called out from his corner, his voice weak. "Sniper. Eastern building, 2nd floor window. He just shot at me." Alexei looked but saw nothing. Then a bullet cracked past his head so close he felt the air displacement. The sniper was good, patient, waiting for targets. This was a new problem. With a sniper watching, they could barely move without exposing themselves to a kill shot. The German infantry was within 30 meters now, moving building to building. An officer was directing them with hand signals, coordinating a final rush. Alexei recognized the tactics from his own training. Pin the enemy with fire from one direction, assault from another. Simple, effective, hard to counter. He made a decision. Instead of firing at the approaching infantry, he aimed at a burning half-track near them. The vehicle had been hit earlier and was smoking. Alexei put a shell into it. The half-track's fuel tank exploded in a massive fireball, sending flaming debris in all directions. The German infantry dove for cover, their assault disrupted. 10 shells remained, but the gun itself was damaged. That last shot from the German machine gun had hit something important. The traverse mechanism was jammed, meaning Alexei could no longer rotate the barrel smoothly. He could still fire, but aiming would be difficult, slow. The gun was dying, just like everything else in this position. A thought crossed his mind unbidden. His brother Mikhail had died in a burning tank. The Germans had shot his T-34 with an anti-tank gun, much like the one Alexei now commanded. The shell had penetrated the armor, and ammunition had exploded inside. Mikhail had burned alive because he refused to abandon his position. Was Alexei making the same mistake? Was stubbornness the same as bravery? Or was there truly a difference? He pushed the thoughts away. Philosophy was for men who had time to think. He had only time to fight. The sniper fired again, and this time the bullet found flesh. Ivan cried out a horrible sound of shock and pain. Alexei crawled to him and saw blood spreading from Ivan's chest. The spotter was gasping, eyes wide with terror. "Sergeant, I cannot breathe. I cannot. Stay with me," Alexei ordered. But he could see the truth. The wound was mortal. Nothing in his first aid kit could fix a chest shot. Ivan knew it too. His hand grabbed Alexei's arm with surprising strength. "Do not let them take the crossroads," Ivan whispered. "My village is 10 kilometers from here. My family," he coughed blood. 10 more minutes, Sergeant." Just 10 more minutes, then Ivan went still. His eyes remained open, staring at nothing. Alexei had lost count of how many men he had seen die. Dozens, hundreds? At some point, the numbers stopped meaning anything. But each death still hit like a hammer blow. Ivan had survived Kiev, survived the retreat, survived years of war. To die here in this forgotten barn seemed impossibly cruel. But war did not care about cruelty. It was just a machine that consumed men and nations with equal indifference. Dmitri was staring at Ivan's body, frozen in shock. "Private," Alexei snapped. "Load the next shell now." The harshness brought Dmitri back to the present. The young man moved mechanically, loading the gun. German voices were very close now. Alexei could hear boots on rubble, weapons being readied. The final assault was coming. He positioned himself behind the gun, damaged traverse and all. The barrel was pointed at the street where the disabled Panzers created a blockade. A German tank commander had apparently decided to try something desperate. A Panzer IV lurched forward, trying to physically push the wrecked tanks aside. Its engine roared with the effort. Metal screamed against metal. The commander stood in the turret, directing the driver. Alexei took careful aim despite the jammed traverse. The range was point blank, maybe 20 meters. At this distance, even the 45mm gun could penetrate heavy armor. He aimed for the turret side where ammunition was stored. He fired, the shell hit perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Panzer IV exploded from the inside. The turret lifted off the chassis on a pillar of fire. The commander was thrown into the air like a rag doll. The explosion was so violent that the shockwave knocked Alexei backward. 9 shells remained. But the gun was definitely broken now. The recoil from that last shot had torn something loose. The barrel drooped at an odd angle. When Dmitri tried to reload, the breech would not close properly. They were finished as an effective anti-tank position. Alexei looked at his young loader. "We need to leave. Now." Dmitri shook his head stubbornly. Ivan said 10 more minutes. "We can give them 10 more minutes. Ivan is dead. We cannot help him by joining him." "My brother died at Kursk," Dmitri said quietly. He held his position. "I will not do less," Alexei understood. They were all carrying ghosts. Dead brothers, dead friends, dead futures. Sometimes those ghosts demanded payment in blood. Sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to refuse to become them. But sometimes, just sometimes, you had to fight not because you could win, but because someone needed you to try. Fine, Alexei said. 10 more minutes. But we fight smart, not stupid. He grabbed his rifle. They had one damaged anti-tank gun with one shell that might not fire properly, 2 rifles, 3 grenades, and 9 anti-tank rounds they could no longer use effectively. Against an entire Panzer division, the German infantry appeared at the barn entrance. This was the breaking point, the moment when everything would end. Alexei raised his rifle and prepared to meet them. The German soldiers appeared in the barn entrance like shadows materializing from smoke. 4 of them, weapons raised, moving with the careful precision of men who had done this 100 times before. They expected to find the gun crew dead or dying. Instead, they found Alexei Volkov standing behind his damaged gun, calmly aiming the barrel at them. The Germans froze. They could see the gun was broken, hanging at a wrong angle. But they could also see the breech was closed, a shell loaded. Maybe it would fire. Maybe it would explode. Nobody wanted to be the one to find out. In that moment of hesitation, Alexei spoke in fluent German, something few Soviet soldiers could do. The gun is aimed at that Panzer behind you, the one with all the fuel drums strapped to its side. If I fire, we all die. So we have a situation. It was a bluff. The gun probably could not fire anymore, and even if it did, the aim was so far off it would miss everything. But the Germans did not know that. They saw a Soviet sergeant who looked calm, almost bored, standing behind a loaded anti-tank gun. They saw death wearing a simple uniform. The German squad leader, a sergeant like Alexei, made a decision. He lowered his rifle slightly and gestured for his men to do the same. "You have fought well," he said in accented Russian. "But this is over. Surrender and live. How many men have you lost taking this position?" Alexei asked. The German sergeant's face hardened. "Enough. Then you understand why I cannot surrender." "Not yet." Behind the Germans, more vehicles were arriving. Alexei could hear them, heavy engines, multiple units. But something was wrong. The engines sounded different, higher pitched. Not German engines. Soviet engines. The German sergeant heard it too. His head turned slightly, uncertainty crossing his face. Then the sound of artillery erupted. Not the distant rumble they had heard all day, but the close, sharp crack of guns firing nearby. Soviet guns. The reinforcements had arrived. In that moment, Alexei made his final decision. He swung the broken gun not toward the Germans in the barn, but toward the Panzer that was trying to clear the roadblock. The damaged Travers screamed in protest. The barrel swung too far, but Alexei fired anyway. The recoil tore the gun completely off its mounting, and the shell went wild, missing the tank. But it hit something better. It struck the ground next to a Panzer IV that had ammunition crates stacked on its rear deck. Common practice for tanks on long advances. The shell exploded near those crates. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the ammunition cooked off in a devastating chain reaction. The first Panzer exploded. Burning ammunition flew in all directions. One piece hit another tank, starting a fire. Another piece hit fuel drums. Within seconds, 3 Panzers were burning, and the ammunition on all of them was exploding. The street became an inferno of fire and metal. The roadblock was no longer just disabled tanks. It was a wall of flame that no vehicle could pass. The explosion threw everyone in the barn to the ground. Alexei landed hard, his damaged gun falling beside him. Dmitri was screaming something, but Alexei could not hear over the ringing in his ears. The German soldiers had been knocked down too, their weapons scattered. Outside, chaos had erupted. Soviet artillery was hitting the German column from behind. The reinforcements were not just coming, they were attacking. The German advance had stalled for so long that Soviet forces had time to prepare a counterattack. What should have been a quick breakthrough had become a trap. The German sergeant scrambled to his feet, grabbed his rifle, and ran from the barn, shouting for his men to withdraw. The other German soldiers followed, no longer interested in capturing one stubborn Soviet gun crew. They had bigger problems now. Alexei tried to stand, but his legs would not work properly. The explosion had done something to him, though he felt no pain. Just numbness. Dmitri appeared beside him, his face covered in blood from a cut on his forehead. "Sergeant, can you walk?" the young private asked. "I think so. Help me up." Together, they stumbled from the barn as it began to collapse behind them. The damaged structure had taken too much punishment. Beams fell. Walls crumbled. The position they had defended for 3 hours simply ceased to exist. Soviet infantry was moving through the village now, clearing buildings, pushing the Germans back. A lieutenant saw Alexei and Dmitri, recognized them as the gun crew that had held the crossroads, and organized men to help them. Medics appeared, wrapping wounds, giving water. Alexei sat on rubble and watched the German column retreat. They were not running, not panicking, but they were definitely withdrawing. The attack had failed. The supply depot was safe. The defensive line would hold. A captain approached a staff officer from division headquarters. "Sergeant Volkov? I am Captain Sokolov. We need to know what happened here. How did 3 men hold against an entire Panzer division?" Alexei looked at him tiredly. "We did not hold. We delayed." "There is a difference." "For how long?" Alexei checked his watch. It had stopped working. The glass cracked from the final explosion. 3 hours. Maybe a bit more. The captain stared. 3 hours. With one 45mm gun. And the right angle, Dmitri added weakly. Sergeant found the perfect angle. They transported Alexei and Dmitri to a field hospital 5 kilometers behind the lines. The doctor said Alexei had a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and severe bruising. Dmitri had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to shrapnel but was otherwise intact. They were the lucky ones. Ivan Petrov was dead, along with thousands of others who had died that day across the Eastern Front. 3 days later, Alexei was sitting outside the hospital tent when Captain Sokolov returned. The officer sat beside him without speaking for a moment, just watching Soviet supply trucks roll past on the road they had defended. "The division commander wants to recommend you for the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal," Sokolov finally said. "Your action at the crossroads saved hundreds of lives. The 3-hour delay allowed us to reposition artillery and organize a proper defense. The German advance in this sector failed completely." Alexei shook his head. "Give the medal to Ivan. He died buying time for his village. We will honor Corporal Petrov. But you survived, Sergeant. That matters too, does it?" Alexei looked at his hands. They were shaking slightly, something that had not stopped since the battle. "I lost half my crew. The gun is destroyed. The barn collapsed. What did we really accomplish?" Sokolov pulled out a map and spread it on the ground between them. He pointed to the crossroads, then traced his finger along the defensive lines behind it. "While you held here, engineers laid minefields. Artillery zeroed their guns. Infantry dug proper trenches. The Germans thought this sector was undefended. Instead, they ran into prepared positions. We destroyed 12 tanks, killed or captured 200 men, and stopped their advance completely. The front line stabilized because of what you did." He looked directly at Alexei. "War is not about one battle or one position, Sergeant. It is about buying time. Time for others to prepare. Time for reserves to arrive. Time for the enemy to make mistakes. You bought us 3 hours, and that changed everything in this sector." Alexei thought about his brother Mikhail, dead in a burning tank. About Ivan, dead in a collapsed barn. About all the men who had held impossible positions across 1,000 kilometers of front line, each one buying minutes or hours with their lives. Maybe Sokolov was right. Maybe those minutes added up to something. "What happened to Private Dmitri?" Alexei asked, sent home. "He lost enough fingers that he cannot load a gun anymore. The war is over for him." "Good, he earned that." Sokolov stood to leave, then paused. "The men are calling your tactic the suicidal angle. Gun crews are asking about it, wanting to know how you did it. You might have invented something, Sergeant." After the captain left, Alexei sat alone with his thoughts. The Battle of Kursk would come in a few months, the largest tank battle in history. Millions of men would fight along the Eastern Front. The war would grind on for 2 more years, consuming cities and nations, but in one small village, at one forgotten crossroads, 3 men had proven something important. That determination could defeat machinery. That time was a weapon. That sometimes the right angle and the wrong position could accomplish the impossible. Alexei would survive the war, though he never spoke much about what happened at that crossroads. He returned home to find his city destroyed, his family scattered, his life unrecognizable. But he had lived, and that was more than millions of others could say. Years later, military historians would study the Eastern Front, analyzing the great battles and famous generals. They would rarely mention a collapsed barn or a suicidal angle. But the soldiers who fought there would remember. They would tell the story of how one gun crew held a crossroads for 3 hours when 5 minutes should have been impossible. That story, passed from veteran to veteran, became a legend. Not about glory or medals, but about the simple, stubborn refusal to give up that defined the Soviet war effort. About ordinary men doing extraordinary things because someone needed them to try. The crossroads still exists today, though the village has long since been rebuilt. There is no monument, no marker, nothing to indicate what happened there. Just an intersection where two roads meet, exactly like thousands of others across that blood-soaked land. But if you stand there quietly, you might imagine you can hear the echo of a small gun firing, again and again, buying time that changed everything.